Plains Indians. Written by Andrew Santella. Who were the first people in North America? It sounded like an earthquake. A herd of bison charged across a grassy plain, their hooves rumbling. Hunters rode on horses at the edge of the herd. Skilled riders, they used only their knees to guide their horses. Each hunter was trying to get close enough to one of the bison to aim a killing blow at the animal's heart. The hunters knew that their families depended on the bison for food and clothing. These hunters were the early people of the Great Plains of North America. For many of the native peoples who lived on the Great Plains, hunting bison was a way of life. Today, bison no longer roam freely across the Great Plains, but the Plains Indians proudly keep alive many of their customs and traditions. American Indian or Native American. Sometimes the native peoples of North America are referred to as American Indians. Sometimes they are called Native Americans. So which is correct? When Italian explorer Christopher Columbus came to the Americas in 1492, he used the names Indios or Indians to describe the native people. This was because he mistakenly believed he was in the Indies, an old term for Asia. Native American came into use in the 1960s as an alternative to Indian. Today, many of these descendants of the first people to live in North America would say that either term is acceptable. Better still, most would prefer to be identified by their unique group, called a nation or tribe. For example, I'm a Cheyenne. What are the Great Plains? The Great Plains area is an immense grassland in the middle of North America. It stretches from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, and from Canada's Saskatchewan River to Texas. It covers part of 14 U.S. states and 3 Canadian provinces. The region's tall grasses bend in the strong winds that blow across the landscape. There are some wooded areas, especially along rivers and creeks, where willow and cottonwood trees grow. But none of the large forests found in other parts of North America exist in the Great Plains. While much of the region is flat, there are a few hilly areas. These include the Ozark Mountains of Missouri and Arkansas, and the Black Hills of South Dakota. Who are the Indians of the Great Plains? On the dry western Great Plains, early Indians lived mainly by hunting bison. Instead of living in permanent villages, they often moved from place to place, following bison herds and gathering wild plants. They became expert hunters and came to depend on the bison for most of their needs. Indian groups of the Great Plains. Some of the Plains Indian groups, or tribes, had once been farmers in the woodlands of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. These people include the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux. Around 1400, they moved to the Great Plains and adopted a nomadic lifestyle. Plains peoples roamed wildly, but most tribes could usually be found in particular areas. For example, the Arapaho hunted mainly in Colorado, and the Cheyenne hunted mainly in Wyoming. farmer-hunters of the Great Plains. On the eastern Great Plains, more plentiful rainfall created conditions favorable to farming. Tribes in these areas raised crops such as corn, beans, and squash. Like tribes to the west, they also hunted buffalo, but they did not share the nomadic lifestyle of the western Plains Indians. Because their farms provided much of what they needed to survive, they were able to live in villages for most of the year. The Wichita people lived along the Arkansas River. In the 1500s, they were among the first Plains Indians to meet Europeans. Further north were the Kansas people, who migrated to present-day Kansas from their original home east of the Mississippi River. What animals did early Plains Indians need? Plains Indians depended on several different kinds of animals to provide many of their daily needs. The bison was at the center of life for the early Plains Indians. The bison is the largest land animal to roam North America in modern times. Even though an adult weighs as much as about 1 ton, or over 2,000 pounds, 900 kilograms, bison can still run at speeds of around 30 miles, 48 kilometers, per hour. For thousands of years, bison roamed the Great Plains in huge herds. These enormous animals provided most of what Plains people needed to live. Plains Indians were experts at hunting bison and at making use of every part of the animal. The clothes they wore and the cone-shaped tents they lived in, called teepees, were made from bison hides. They sharpened the bones of bison and carved them into tools. They used the horns of bison to make spoons, cups, rattles, and toys. They braided shaggy bison hair into rope. Of course, bison were an important source of food too. After men hunted the animals, see pages 18 and 19, women cut up the bison meat. They preserved some of it for later by cutting it into long strips and hanging it to dry on racks in the hot sun. Once meat was dried this way, it could be stored for long periods without spoiling. The bison was like a walking store, providing food, clothing, tools, and more. Even bison waste was put to use. Plains Indians used it as fuel for their campfires. Transportation. Before they acquired horses, early Plains Indians traveled on foot. They relied on dogs to carry heavy loads as they followed bison herds across the plains. They loaded their supplies and belongings onto a kind of sled called a travois. A travois was made of 2 poles tied together in a V shape with strips of rawhide stretched across the V. The travois was attached to the shoulders of a dog, which dragged the load behind itself. Horses. The first modern horses were brought to North America by Spanish explorers in the 1600s. Small, early horses had once lived in North America millions of years ago, but they had died out by around 9000 BCE. Plains Indians began to acquire horses through trading with other tribes or by raiding other tribes. By the late 1700s, horses were common among Plains Indians. Horses changed the way Plains Indians lived. With horses, Plains Indians could travel farther and faster than ever before. It made their nomadic lifestyle easier, allowing them to move their camps from place to place as they followed the bison. Plains Indians also found that they could track and hunt bison more effectively on horseback. Tribes such as the Crow gave up their farming lifestyle to become nomadic hunters. Horses also made them more effective warriors, able to attack their enemies quickly and suddenly. Hunting. Hunting was one of the most important parts of the Plains Indian culture. Plains Indians hunted many animals, but none was more important to them than the bison. The nomadic tribes moved from place to place to stay close to the wandering bison. Farming tribes of the prairies left their villages each summer to take part in annual hunts. Hunting was a community activity for the peoples of the Great Plains. Men, women, and children worked together to make a successful hunt. The bravest and most skillful hunters and warriors sometimes acted as the hunt police. Their job was to organize the other hunters so that they worked as a team. Plains Indians developed clever techniques for hunting bison. Hunters on foot might sneak up on a herd by covering themselves in wolf skins. This way, they could get close to the animals without alarming them. Another strategy was to start grass fires that would frighten the bison into stampeding to their deaths off tall cliffs. After Plains Indians acquired horses, they became skillful riders who could hunt while moving at high speeds. When the hunt was over and the bison were killed, there was still much work to do. Women worked to preserve the meat for future use. They also worked at tanning the bison hide, turning it into leather that could be used for robes and bedding. What did early Plains Indians farm? Farming was the main source of food and wealth for those early Plains Indians that lived in villages. Farming tribes lived on very fertile land along the major rivers of the Great Plains. With plentiful rain and good growing conditions, they could grow more corn and other crops than they needed. Extra crops could be traded with other tribes for metal tools, cloth, bison hides, and other valuable goods. Farming was mainly the work of women. They planted the fields, tended them, and harvested the crops. Their tools were made from things found in the natural world around them. They used animal bones, horns, and antlers to make hoes and rakes. Women also made clay pots for storing food. The Three Sisters. Corn, or maize as American Indians called it, was the most important crop for most tribes. It grew well in many areas, was easily stored, and could be prepared in a variety of ways. It could be used in soups and stews, or it could be dried and pounded into cornmeal. Women used wooden tools called pestles to grind dried corn into meal. Farming tribes almost always planted corn alongside squash and beans. Corn stalks provided a pole for bean vines to climb. The leaves of the squash plant helped keep the soil moist. Because the three crops worked so well together, they were often called the Three Sisters. Farming tribes also grew pumpkins, sunflowers, and tobacco. What were the early Plains Indian communities like? The nomadic hunters of the early Great Plains lived in teepees. Teepees were made of bison hides sewn together. The hides covered a frame of wooden poles that formed a cone shape. Inside the teepee was a fire pit lined with rocks. Beds made of bison hides were arranged around the fire. People often decorated teepee covers with painted figures that represented the family or showed the great deeds of the hunter or warrior who lived inside. As people moved across the Great Plains, they carried their teepees with them. Teepees could be quickly taken apart and put back together with each move to a new camp. Houses of farming peoples. Since the farming tribes of the prairie did not move around as much as the nomadic hunters, they built more permanent homes. The Wichita and Caddo people built grass houses by covering a circular framework of wooden poles with thick bundles of grass called thatch. Other farming tribes lived in earth lodges with dome-like roofs. These lodges were made of heavy timber posts, covered by willow branches and layers of sod, the surface layer of the ground, and earth. People entered their lodge through a covered tunnel. This led to a roomy interior that could hold a number of families or related persons. Like the hunting tribes, farming people also used teepees, but only for their yearly hunting trips onto the Great Plains. Roles for men and women. Men and women each had their own roles to play in daily life. For men, life revolved around hunting and warfare. They trained and tended horses, and they made weapons such as bows, arrows, and lances. They also were leaders, making decisions about where their people should hunt and whether they should start a war. Women tended farm fields and homes. They put up and took down teepees. They made clothing, hauled firewood, and prepared meals. They cared for children and carried infants on their back in baby carriers called cradle boards as they worked. A day in the life of an early Plains Indian child. On a typical day in an early Plains Indian village, children might listen to storytellers tell about the history of their people. Boys might prepare to become warriors and hunters by learning to ride horses and shoot bows and arrows at targets. Girls would probably learn the skills of cooking, sewing, and other crafts as they helped their mothers. How did contact with non-Indians affect Plains Indians? The Spanish explorer Francisco Vázquez de Coronado came to the plains of Kansas in 1541. He reported meeting Indians in skin tents who hunted wild cows. He was the first European to meet Plains Indians and to see their teepees and the bison they hunted. Spanish, French, and later U.S. traders came to the Great Plains in search of valuable bison hides. The Indians acquired guns from these traders. This made them more effective hunters and more fearsome warriors. Tragically, white traders also brought with them smallpox and other diseases. This took a terrible toll on Plains Indians. Thousands of Plains Indians died of such diseases, and some entire tribes were wiped out. Settlers moved west. As the United States expanded westward in the late 1800s, non-Indian settlers began to move across the Great Plains. Trails and railroads began to stretch across the Great Plains all the way to California. At the same time, Non-Indian hunters trying to sell bison hides for profit slaughtered the animals by the hundreds and thousands. Bison nearly died out in the 1800s. Farmers and ranchers looking for land set their sights on the Great Plains. Even though Indians considered the Great Plains their home, settlers saw the land as open country that they could simply take. War for the Great Plains. In the mid-1800s, the U.S. government tried to force Plains Indians to move to reservations. Reservations were public lands set aside as homelands for Indians. On reservations, the Plains Indians would have to give up many of their traditional ways of life and depend on the government for support. Plains Indians fought back. In 1876, thousands of Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne warriors wiped out a force of U.S. soldiers led by General George Custer near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. Custer's defeat only made the United States more determined to conquer the Plains Indians. Reservations. The U.S. Army began to capture bands of Plains Indians. By the 1880s, the last of the Plains Indians had been confined to reservations. The U.S. government promised Indians that they would be taken care of on the reservations, but too often Plains Indians found only poverty and sickness. Some turned to a new movement called the Ghost Dance religion, which taught that a sacred dance would restore the bison and force non-Indian settlers to leave. Some Lakota Sioux participating in a ghost dance clashed with U.S. soldiers at Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. Over 150 Lakota were killed and the ghost dance movement faded. The wars for the Great Plains were over. What is modern life like for Plains Indians? At the start of the 1900s, life on the reservations was harsh. People on reservations were very poor and had poor quality health care. Reforms brought some improvement. First, in 1924, the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act. This made all Indians citizens of the United States. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 tried to give Indians more control over their lives and allow them to practice traditional ceremonies. But some Plains reservations remained among the poorest places in the country. In 1968, Plains Indians played a leading part in forming the American Indian Movement. This group fights for Indians' rights. In 1973, members of the AIM took over the village of Wounded Knee for 71 days. Their actions focused attention on the problems faced by American Indians. Plains Indians today. Today, Plains Indians live not only on reservations, but also in cities, suburbs, and small towns all across the United States and throughout the world. At tribal colleges, people can prepare for employment and learn about traditional ways. More and more Plains Indians are taking an interest in the languages and traditions of their people. At gatherings, they dress in colorful costumes and proudly perform traditional dances. By remembering their proud history, they prepare for successful futures. Biography. Billy Mills. Billy Mills, born 1938, is an Oglala Lakota, or Sioux, who was raised on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. In 1964, he won the gold medal in the 10,000-meter race in the Olympics in Tokyo, Japan. He later helped found Running Strong for American Indian Youth, a group that helps young American Indians in need. Timeline. About 10,000 BCE, people crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America. About 500 CE, native peoples of the Great Plains began farming. 1541, Spaniard Francisco Vázquez de Coronado explores the southern Great Plains. About 1700, Plains tribes begin to acquire horses. 1841, settlers bound for Oregon begin crossing the Great Plains on the Oregon Trail. 1864, Colorado volunteers attacked a Cheyenne village in the Sand Creek Massacre, killing hundreds of men, women, and children. 1869, railroads stretch across the Great Plains to span the entire continent. 1876, U.S. General George Custer and the 7th Cavalry are defeated by the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne at Little Bighorn. Late 1800s, bison nearly die out because of too much hunting. 1890, Sioux ghost dancers are killed by the U.S. Army at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act makes all Indians full citizens of the United States. 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act grants Indians more power to govern themselves. 1960, Ben Rifle elected to the House of Representatives from South Dakota, the first Sioux elected to Congress. 1964, Billy Mills wins a gold medal at the Olympics in Tokyo. 1968, the American Indian Movement is founded. 1973, American Indians occupied the village of Wounded Knee for 71 days. 1990, Congress passes the Native American Languages Act to preserve, protect, and promote the rights and freedoms of all Native Americans to use, practice, and develop Native American languages. 1990, U.S. Congress passes Act declaring November American Indian Heritage Month. 1992, Ben Nighthorse Campbell of the Northern Cheyenne elected to United States Senate from Colorado. 2004.